In the last 3 days, we talked about operant conditioning and classical conditioning. Spent 1 day on classical, 2 days on operant types and schedules. Today, we're going to be going through the terms for the unit and just kind of cleaning up the terms. There's a bunch of stuff about classical and operant that we haven't yet talked about. So this terms sheet is attached, and I'm just going to go top to bottom, and we'll talk about the stuff that we haven't talked about. Learning on the Quizlet I've defined as a relatively permanent behavior change due to experience, but it's just learning, adding things to your memory after experiencing something. Behaviorism was the branch of, we already talked about behaviorism, but behaviorism is a branch of psychology that says that you should only study what is actually observable. They're very concerned with this kind of thing. If you act on somebody, what is the reaction? Action-reaction on people. Associative learning is what classical conditioning is. It's learning to associate two things. In the case of classical conditioning, that would be the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus. Once they are associated together, the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, or in other words, like associating food with a bell. And then once that association is learned, the neutral stimulus of bell becomes the conditioned stimulus of bell, and bell elicits a new conditioned or learned response. John Watson did a kind of perverse experiment. I have rat baby here in parentheses. It's unfortunate I can't show you the video because I'd get put in YouTube jail. But there's a video that exists online where John Watson wanted to classically condition a baby to be afraid of a white rat. He showed on video that the baby was not afraid of a white rat at the beginning, but then he used classical conditioning to make the baby afraid of a white rat. And if you think to yourself, how could you make a baby afraid of a white rat using classical conditioning? You could probably do it several different ways, but what he did was he paired a scary stimulus with the white rat. So he showed baby not afraid of white rat, and then he clanged a loud gong, made a scary noise, made the baby scared and cry. So he would do the gong and then show the baby the white rat, pair those two things together, and now he showed that the baby was afraid of the white rat. So I definitely couldn't do that experiment today, thank goodness, but he did it, and he showed that classical conditioning. I'm just going to skip the stuff we've already talked about, including Pavlov and all the types of classical conditioning that's in the previous video. Acquisition is the first phase of classical conditioning. So that is when you're initially pairing the unconditioned stimulus to the neutral stimulus. That would be acquisition. As you're learning to acquire the conditioned response between those things. There are 3 ineffective or bad types of classical conditioning. The best kind of classical conditioning is you have neutral stimulus come immediately before the unconditioned stimulus. So you ring a bell, and then you give the dog food. In that order, and fairly quickly. Trace conditioning is if there's the neutral stimulus, then there's a pause, then there's the unconditioned stimulus. So that would be like you ring a bell, wait 60 seconds, then give the dog food. That still might work, but it's better to have no pause there. Trace conditioning is with the pause. Doesn't work as well. Simultaneous conditioning would be the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus at the same time. That doesn't work as well. You prefer a short pause, bell, then food. Don't ring the bell while you're giving the dog food. Doesn't work quite as well. Backwards conditioning would be the unconditioned stimulus and then the neutral stimulus. So that also doesn't work as well. That would be you give the dog food, then afterwards ring a bell. Also doesn't work as well. Neutral stimulus and shortly after the neutral stimulus, unconditioned stimulus works the best for classical conditioning. Those are 3 ineffective types of classical conditioning. Higher order conditioning would be you have multiple neutral stimuluses. You have like neutral stimulus 1, which precedes neutral stimulus 2, which precedes the unconditioned stimulus. So that would be like you turn on the light in the room, then you ring a bell, then you give the dog food. In some backwards thinking way, the dog would still associate the lights to the food because the lights mean the bell's going to come, the bell means the food's going to come. So that's just like one disconnected conditioning. Extinction is very important. Extinction is when you present the neutral stimulus over and over, and it eventually, without the unconditioned stimulus, and eventually the conditioned response will stop. Think about this. If the dog that's been conditioned that bell means food is coming, you ring a bell, the dog salivates to the bell because the dog's learned that bell means food's coming. So you ring a bell, dog salivates. But what if you go 20 days in a row ringing a bell and not giving the dog food? So you give the dog food, but you ring a bell at other times and don't give it food. Eventually, that dog is going to stop salivating to the sound of the bell. If you present the neutral stimulus, or in that case, bell, over and over without the food, eventually that's going to stop. Extinction is very important in phobia deconditioning, which is actually all of the next terms. Extinction is the goal of that. So if you have a phobia that's created from classical conditioning, which a lot of them can be, the goal of that kind of therapy would be extinction of the conditioned response. So if you've had a bad experience with dogs, if a dog bit you when you were young, you could have a classically conditioned fear of dogs. So in that case, the unconditioned stimulus would be something like dog bite. The unconditioned response from a dog bite, which everyone would experience the same thing, would be like pain or fear as the dog is biting you. But the neutral stimulus would be just sight of dogs. That's not a good thing. You don't want dogs to make you afraid. So the conditioned stimulus, once sight of dogs has been paired, the dog bite, the conditioned stimulus would then become also sight of dogs. And the new learned or conditioned response would be fear of dogs. So whenever you see a dog, you have fear, or just fear in general. So if you go to therapy to make yourself not afraid of dogs, you want the sight of dogs not to have you be afraid anymore. So you want to decondition that. There's a number of ways you can do that. But the goal is extinction. Spontaneous recovery with the Pavlov's dog could be if you kept presenting the bell over and over without the food, dogs stop salivating to the bell, but then on the 21st day, you ring the bell and give the dog food again. That dog is probably going to immediately on the 22nd day associate bells and food again and spontaneously recover. Same thing with if you did exposure therapy and train yourself not to be afraid of dogs, and it was great, but then you see a dog attack with the neutral stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus being paired again, your fear is probably going to come back. So it's spontaneous recovery after extinction. Let's skip generalization for now. Phobia. I ask the class all the time, what is a phobia? And most people say a fear of something, which isn't entirely true. Because a phobia, if you are next to you see a rattlesnake in a field you're in, you're really close to it, and you're afraid you're going to get bit, is that a phobia? No, because rattlesnakes are poisonous, and that's a healthy fear. So phobia is afraid of something irrationally. If you're afraid of looking at a picture of a spider, pictures of spiders can hurt you. That would be a phobia, an irrational fear. There are a few ways you can extinguish phobias or any kind of classically conditioned pair, and that would be with either a systematic desensitization, also called graduated exposure or gradual exposure, or flooding. Systematic desensitization is slowly exposing your phobia in gradual steps. To do this, you would make a hierarchy of fears. A hierarchy of fears, if you're afraid of, say, clowns, would be you'd rank an order of events, which would be progressively more scary with clowns that you could do. So number one would be fairly easy. That'd be like, think about a clown. Number two could be look at a picture of a clown. Number three, look at a video of a clown. Number four, see an actual clown. And number five could be like, I don't know, get close to a clown. Something like that. And the way that systematic desensitization would work you'd start with the easiest one, you'd stay with the easiest one, and you'd rate your anxiety. So you think about a clown, and then your anxiety is probably pretty high, but you stay with that thought until the anxiety level drops to a manageable amount. Then you go to number two, and number two is going to raise your anxiety. You stay with that until your anxiety drops, then 3, 4, and 5. And eventually your anxiety will go down with all of them because you can't stay at a 10 anxiety forever. That's just not how humans work. That would be gradual exposure. Flooding is where you just expose yourself to a fairly intense version of the fear all at once, you have panic attack level anxiety, but it will eventually also go down. There's great videos on YouTube of this happening as well, including a lady going into a room with a clown that really hates clowns, which we'll watch when we get back in school. Generalization is when the NS gets more broad. Broad. And discrimination is when the neutral stimulus stays narrow, and I'll explain that. Generalization would be like if Pavlov's dog salivated to the sound of that bell, but he also salivated to the sound of a doorbell, and like any kind of a beeping sound, like a backing up truck. If he salivated to all those things, that would be generalization of the neutral stimulus. If the dog only salivated to that specific bell sound and not other bell sounds, that would be discrimination. Same thing could happen if you see a dog attack happen, and then you're afraid of that dog, but not dogs. That would be discrimination. Generalization would be if you're afraid of all dogs, or maybe even all pets. That would be generalization. Moving on to operant conditioning. The law of effect created by Edward Thorndike, one of the big people in operant conditioning and behaviorism as well, just says, it's kind of the law that explains operant conditioning. It says if you reward a behavior, you get more of it. If you punish behavior, you get less of it. That's the whole point of operant conditioning in the first place. An operant conditioning chamber, nicknamed a Skinner box, is the box that Skinner put pigeons in and rats in to easily operantly condition them. He made several different types of the box, but he made it so that the rat or pigeon could be easily reinforced with food when doing something, whether that was pecking a disc or a lever or something like that. Shaping behavior is not one individual categorical behavior like sit for a dog, but it's a more complex behavior where you reinforce periodically to form a complex behavior. There's a great video on YouTube of a person training a dog to fetch slippers. It only takes it about 90 seconds from learning, not at all knowing how to fetch slippers, to knowing how to perfectly fetch slippers. And she does it through shaping using a technique called successive approximations. So doing this, she identifies a target behavior, which is fetch the slipper that is, 5 feet away from me, then bring it to my lap. That's the target behavior. But since that's a little bit more complex than something like sit, you want to train it using successive approximations. So you shape the behavior. You start with whatever the dog does. So you say fetch, and at first the dog might walk towards the slippers, and that's close to the target behavior, sort of. So you say good fetch as the dog gets kind of close to the slippers. Now, that's not entirely what you want, but you're you're molding the behavior, or shaping the behavior. Once the dog gets close to the slippers, you say good boy. Then once the dog eventually puts its mouth on the slippers, you'll reward for that. You will no longer reward for just getting close to the slippers, only if it puts its mouth on. Then if it eventually picks up the slippers, you say, good boy for picking up the slippers. You no longer reward for the farther away behavior, like just putting your mouth on the slippers, only for picking up the slippers. And then once you gradually shape and reward only when they get closer and closer to the behavior, shaping more complex behaviors. A discriminative stimulus would be a second stimulus that allows you to know to ask for a separate stimulus. Let me show a picture here. So in this picture, you see the two lights. This rat could have been trained that the blue light means the lever will give the rat food, but the orange light means the lever will not give the rat food. In this case, the lights would be the discriminative stimulus. I just looked it up online, and they gave a good example about if you are at grandma's house, you know that you can ask for candy and probably be given candy, but if you're at school or your parents' house and you ask for candy, then you probably will not receive candy. So in that case, the grandmother would be the discriminative stimulus, which would mediate whether or not a more primary stimulus would be effective. I'm going to skip reinforcer. That's just operant conditioning. Primary and secondary reinforcer. Primary reinforcer is something that is rewarding for its own sake, and secondary is something that represents something that is reinforcing. A primary reinforcer would be like food. Drugs, don't do drugs, but it would be a primary reinforcer. Food, tastes good, it just does. Drugs, feel good, it just does. They don't represent something, they just are that thing. Secondary reinforcer would be like money. Money means nothing. It represents your ability to acquire things. Grades in school would also be secondary reinforcers. They don't mean anything. They just represent things. They represent that you did well in school, or that it's more likely you'll go into college or something like that. Primary reinforcers are inherently rewarding. Secondary are not. They represent things that are rewarding. Schedule is what we talked about in one of the videos. We didn't call it this, but partial reinforcement is that whole grid. Continuous reinforcement is you get reinforced every single time. Partial reinforcement is the combination of either fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, variable interval. So all four of these. Latent learning. A lot of learning happens on purpose. If you're trying to memorize the 50 state capitals, that's not latent learning. That's learning on purpose. Latent learning would be implicit learning, unconscious learning. So when you went to McGinnis the first time, you probably did not intend to remember your teacher's names or how to get from the math wing to the theology wing or something. You just kind of unconsciously learned it over time. Insight is a sudden solution to a problem. That is the aha moment in math class where you finally figure out how to solve that problem. There are two types of motivation, and it's unfortunate that we can't go into more depth here on this video, but it's really, there's a lot of really good studies on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. There's a really, really great video on YouTube that explains them. There's books written about both of these, but intrinsic motivation is being motivated to do something because you actually enjoy doing the thing. Extrinsic motivation is doing something because of an external reward. So intrinsic motivation, like, by counterintuitively, when you reward someone for doing something, you can actually make them less motivated to do the thing. In some cases, like, I really like working on my yard, like mowing. I enjoy mowing my yard. I enjoy planting things. But when you pay me to do that for somebody else, it becomes a lot less fun because then it becomes work. So that would shift it from intrinsic motivation to extrinsic motivation. Observational learning is it's just like it sounds, learning through observing. There's a famous experiment, the Bobo doll experiment, is Albert Bandura that did this one. He had kids, kind of an expected result, but he had kids go into a room and watch an adult in one of two conditions. They either watch the adult play nicely with what they call this Bobo doll, which is just an inflatable clown doll that has sand at the bottom, so if you punch it, it pops back up. The adult either played nicely with the doll, or the adult was aggressive with the doll. And the children, I guess as you would expect, did kind of what the adults did. So if the adult was playing nice, the kid went in there and played nice. If the adult was being aggressive, the kid played aggressive. But not only that, the kid also invented new, unique ways to be aggressive. So in both cases, there were like toy guns in the room. There were hammers in the room. I think the adult did use a hammer to pound the doll in the aggressive condition, but they did not use a gun. And when the children watched the adult be aggressive, they would overwhelmingly pick up the gun and also pretend to shoot the doll, whereas they would not do that in the nice conditions. So they modeled the behavior, but even expanded on the aggressive behavior. And that would also be modeling. Mirror neurons are really cool. It's a neuron that is activated when you actually do something or when you watch someone do something. So if I were to show you a video, there's videos on YouTube. The thing I usually show is there's a cactus compilation of, it's always boys. It's boys, like shirtless boys, jumping into cactuses. So there's like fields of cactuses and they just jump into the cactus. And they, of course, with the result you'd expect, they're in a lot of pain. And you can see all the cactus quills all over their body. But when you watch that, you'll actually feel pain as they jump into the cactus because of a thing called mirror neurons. It is fired when you watch someone do something or if you actually do it yourself. Also, if you watch a video of someone eating ice cream, you can almost kind of taste the ice cream there as well. So that is the learning unit.